And let us pray. Loving God, we never quite know when we're living within the borders of your holy vision of the present and future, and when we aren't. We don't always know if our words reflect well on your word, or if we made something up without understanding you. We say things like, we never know the good we're doing, and then again, we rarely acknowledge the lousy things we're doing. So God, most loving, the church in America is a hot mess. Many of our efforts to genuinely change our ways are futile. The world is so big, and the church seems so small and struggling. There's a vast ocean of human misery, and on this Sunday morning in July, our boat, called Coventryville Church, is small atop the waves. And yet, with love, we give you what we have to expand your present-future shared vision. Receive us as citizens of your kingdom of heaven, even when we don't know or see it. Use what you've given us to improve your world. Don't let our attempts at trustworthiness be wasted. We ask this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. First, sow the seed, then the reaping comes. First, sow the seed, then the reaping comes. Keep that in mind. There's a familiar saying, perhaps you've heard it, it goes something like this: insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same results. If your grandchild said, "Poppy, what's insanity?" I would say, "Honey, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting to get different results, and you don't get it." "What do you mean, Poppy?" I said, "You'll learn. Grow up, you'll understand what I mean." How many of you have heard that quote before? Some of you ever heard that definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. Doesn't quite work. It's got a practical application. It's very evident to everyone who's ever used it, but I can tell you its wisdom is not regularly followed by human beings. It should be intuitive, but it's not. How many of you will admit to yourself that you've walked on that metaphorical treadmill of doing something repeatedly while desperately hoping that something would change? How many of you have tried to lose weight while changing nothing about what you eat, or not increasing your exercise, or putting any new demands on yourself, but expecting to lose weight? How many of you have expected to improve your work productivity by waiting until the last minute to get an assignment done because you think that last minute pressure is an inspiration rather than just a sign of your procrastination? How many of you are hoping to attract more customers to your business by using the same tired old advertising campaign that you designed and you loved 40 years ago and still do, but can't let go of it? But everyone else is telling you, "Hey, it's tired and it's passé. Please change it to something else." And how many of you will admit to yourselves that churches, that this church, have walked or run on the metaphorical treadmill of doing something repeatedly while desperately hoping that something will change? How about clinging to lifeless and spiritless traditional or contemporary worship formats, hoping to attract new people and younger generations? How about engaging the community with outreach programming that doesn't ask what non-churchgoers need in their lives to connect to God? Oh yes, you'll start a program, and when no one new comes, you'll say, "See, no one comes when we do things for them." That's because you didn't ask them what they need. You want them to need and want what you need and want. But human beings are very funny. They have their own needs and their own wants, and they'll be happy to tell you what they are. How about equating attendance and at worship and church meetings as deep discipleship and spirituality? How about adopting fads in worship or music and programming that mirror the culture rather than offering an alternative to it? How about playing into the idea of appealing to people as though they're consumers, that they're customers to be won over by a brand, rather than souls that are longing for redeeming? How about hiding the realities of membership, attendance, and financial decline while hoping to keep people from leaving the church, acting as if honesty is the best policy everywhere but here in the church? First, sow the seed. Then the reaping comes. Now, when it comes to sowing seed, that familiar saying about insanity never ever implies reaping will never come unless you sow the seed first. Reaping will never ever precede sowing. If you're out in your field waiting for the reaping but haven't planted a seed, now that's truly insanity, wouldn't you say? But it does apply when, while a sower's seed is growing, the sower seeds weeds growing side by side. If the sower, year after year, when the wheat and the weeds are growing side by side, if the sower, year after year, were to get angry and frustrated and go in and start pulling out what you think are the weeds and you're grabbing some wheat, and at the same time bemoaning the fact that you have a lower yield every year than you should, well, I have to tell you, that's nuts. Imagine doing that year after year and complaining, why don't I get the harvest that I'm looking for? In today's parable, every single listener who was sitting around Jesus as he was telling the parable of the field or the parable of the wheat and the weeds knew precisely what Jesus was saying to them agriculturally. And Matthew, the only gospel writer to include this parable, wants us to know too. There's at least one disappointing way that the first century resembles the 21st century, and that is the culture of antagonism. The first century was a century of antagonism, a culture of antagonism. In the first century, when you were born into a family, you were not only born into the family's status or their property or their friends, you also were born into an inheritance of their enemies. Your family's enemies were your enemies too. The generational conflict was real and it was enduring, and the antagonism among enemies was all-encompassing. Jesus' listeners assumed that an enemy sowed weeds among the wheat in order to embarrass the landowner. Who wouldn't want to do that to your enemy if you could? That's what enemies did to each other. Sowing weed seed ruins crops the way sowing gossip ruins relationships, reputations. Those same listeners who have expected the parable's landowner to retaliate, to preserve his honor and his status, are bemused because he didn't. What did he do instead? He kept his composure. He didn't react. He saw the more excellent vision of the future that God was preparing for Israel and for the world through the mission and the ministry of Jesus. No, don't pull the weeds. The wheat is stronger than the weeds. Wait for the weeds to bloom, then you'll know which ones to remove and which to leave alone. Then gather the weeds and we'll use them for fuel. The parable's landowner refused to avenge himself. He followed a more excellent way. Now, in a century dedicated to revenge for even the tiniest slight, Jesus' landowner proves to be more powerful as a cultural influencer by doing nothing and patiently waiting. First, sow the seed, then comes the reaping. I almost didn't include Matthew's interpretation of this parable in today's reading. I thought to leave it out because I think Matthew got it wrong. And a sermon, I will admit, is not the right vehicle for a Bible study, but a few words on the interpretation might be helpful. Even the earliest commentators, the most ancient Christian commentators on this parable, doubted Matthew's motive for including it. Why? Because the interpretation veers so far away from the radical message of Jesus' parable and makes it more about judgment. By the way, Matthew seems to love judgment. Remember the sheep and the goats? That's only in Matthew's gospel. The early commentators' doubts, they were on to something. They may have known what archaeology suggested in the 20th century, that Matthew's Christian community, think of this, around the gospel writers were Christian communities, and they were often writing their gospels for their particular community, that their particular community would have known some very specific stories about Jesus. And so they wanted to encapsulate those stories, no longer in oral forms of communication, because the apostles grew old and died while they waited for Jesus' imminent return. He did not return in the way he said that he would. And so they began to write down from their sources the stories about Jesus that were very, very important to them. And such was the case with Matthew's community. Think of Matthew writing his gospel for Matthew's church. And in that community for whom he wrote the gospel, he had decided, the Christian community, had actually decided to set up shop on the opposing corner from where the synagogue was in ancient Antioch. Now think of that. As the gospel is beginning to spread, Jewish Christians in the synagogue in Antioch were having their hearts and lives filled by the love and grace of Christ. And they were talking to their Jewish friends in the synagogue, and they were arguing about it. Some weren't interested in Jesus of Nazareth, others were. And within the synagogue, there was conflict. So what did the Christians do? Did they move to a different town? No, they just moved right across the street to the corner and started a church there. How many of you are McDonald's people? Wouldn't you just love then to see a Burger King come up across the street? No, you want everyone to eat McDonald's. When I was serving a church in Westchester, on one corner on Gay Street in Westchester was a McDonald's and a Burger King and a Wendy's and an Arby's. You could go around, and people told me, yeah, one kid likes McDonald's, the other kid likes Burger King, and then my wife likes Arby's, and so we go around. I mean, imagine getting so conflicted that you want to hurt your enemy by opening up a shop right across the street. And there's written evidence about this in archaeology, that that's what Matthew's community did. They set up an opposing community of faith. And it may be that Matthew is commenting on that conflict in that interpretation related to wheat and weeds. No doubt, Matthew thought his community was wheat, and the other shop across the way, they were weeds. Well, but there's another possible explanation for Matthew's interpretation, and that is an interpretation that there was life-killing conflict going on within Matthew's own church. Now, I'm guessing that there has never been a boiled-up hot mess ever here in 249 years at Coventryville Methodist Episcopal, and then United Methodist Church. Am I right? You've never boiled over into a congregational mess, have you? You have? I'm shocked and dismayed to be among a church that's had conflict. Well, you know, when a church has conflict, it feeds off it. And then the conflict hangs around for a while. It's called a conflict cycle. And the cycle goes on too long. And then the cycle becomes a vortex that pulls everything down. Look, if you're a married person, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know that in a marriage, you need to keep some kind of harmony between a comfort cycle and a conflict cycle. If a comfort cycle goes on too long, you can get bored. And if a conflict cycle goes on too long, you can just be angry every day. You have to know when to take a risk. And if you're in a conflict cycle too long, try to step out of it and bring it down a little bit in temperature and cool it off and really see the person that you married for who you remember them to be and why you're with them in the first place. And if you're in a comfort cycle too long, be smart about it, but maybe mix it up a little bit. Hey honey, let's go take a square dancing class at the community college. What are you talking about? Yeah, do something to sort of spark it up a little bit and get some energy back. Kathy and I are celebrating our anniversary in 2 days. We've been married for a long time, and we've gone through our comfort and conflict cycles like every other marriage. But we don't stay in them too long so they become dangerous. And the one thing I know about being married to Kathy for all these years is the most important thing about that is the promise. You don't know this, but Kathy's been married 5 times. To me. To me. Over the time that we've been married, I think I've changed at least 5 times. I'm not the same person she married those years ago. I'm growing, I'm changing, I'm who I am. And for some reasons that I can't explain, she's still stuck with me. It isn't just the love, it's the promise. I promised that year after year, on the 25th of July, I would still be here. And so did she. And so did you when you made your vows to this church that you would be here. And when the church needed you, you would come. Not because of what you wanted to do, but what the church needs to do through you. I once heard a pastor in our annual conference who had bailed out of local church pastoral ministry for administration in one of our continuing care retirement communities. I heard him say in a group that I was a part of that over the years of his vocation, he had encountered, quote, the best and worst human beings in the church, not in the world. He said he'd enjoyed preaching and teaching and visiting and comforting the ill and the dying, but he couldn't stand church people at meetings where the snidest, most ignorant and cruel criticism, where arguments and factions ate away at his soul over the years, and he bailed. To be fair, in that conversation, he was projecting years of local church service, very good service at that moment, and he was feeling vulnerable. But I have no doubt in my mind that he was sincere. Jesus' parable is supposed to teach us that patience, not judgment, is required in the church when good and lousy appear to thrive together. Now, I know that's easier said than done. But it might be a comfort to recall that Jesus' own hand-picked disciples, all 12 of them, were a grab bag of people, some of them good, others of them downright lousy, because wheat and weeds grow together. Weeds and wheat look alike for a while, and then the true grain appears. And unless something has changed, I don't think there's a single person in this room, including me, who has developed the power to really see into a person's heart and spirit and to know if your soul has been redeemed by the love of the risen Christ. I can't look at you and tell if you are inherently a good or a lousy person, but you will tell me by how you act toward others. As with the disciples before us, church messes get hot when people work through their hurts while they're also hurting other people. They don't plan to do that. It's just the way they're working it through. You know, hurt people hurt people. That's what hurt people do. That might have been what was going on in the hot mess in Matthew's church. People hurting other people. And I say this with a fondness for you and for every church I ever served and for every church that exists today. We owe each other better. First, sow the seed Then the reaping comes. The seed goes out. And what happens next is not my business, and it's not your business. It's God's business. The seed falls to the ground. Some of the seed is good, some of the seed is lousy. That's God's mess. And when it's time, the wheat and the weeds will reveal their true selves, their true nature. Hopefully, you see where I've been going with these themes of doing the same thing over and over again is crazy. And when you get crazy, you do crazy things. You say crazy things. You become like a crazy person, even with the people you love the most. And hurt people. We don't get anywhere hurting people. People have been doing the insanity thing from at least the book of Genesis to the book of Matthew, and from the book of Matthew all the way here to the book of Coventryville United Methodist Church. I want you to ask yourself, what will the results be if you continue to do what you're doing? I don't know what you're doing, but I know that you are human beings. And I know that you're doing some things that you've always done, expecting different results. I want to know when. When will the results change? Let's not fool ourselves. Our lousy seed can easily make a hot mess of the church's witness. And so far, the Methodists have been doing a bang-up job of creating a hot mess. How do you know? Because you can read about it. It's still all over the news. 20% of United Methodist churches have disaffiliated from each other. I've heard people say, well, that's the lower bottom 20% that we wanted out anyway. That's a very comforting thing to say if you're cruel and ignorant and snide. We're talking about human beings. Our hot mess is all over the news. So to be fair, God's world is a mess. It's a hot mess. And that's not on us alone, that's also on God. And our nation is a hot mess. And that prompts me to ask, when will we let the radical way of this parable of the wheat and the weeds take root in us? I think this year it will be when we embrace the question of the farmhands who threw out the seed. Remember what they asked the landowner? Sir, didn't you give us good seed to throw? Sir, wasn't it good seed that we sowed out there in the field? That's like asking the good Lord, hey, Lord, didn't you say each day after creation, that's good? And that on the sixth day you said that was very good. Remember? When the human creatures were made. That was a very good day in the creation story in Genesis. God decides to let the good thrive with the lousy for a time and take a risk. And yes, sometimes good and evil thrive together. Ever notice that when people announce that they're leaving the church, I'm leaving the church, and you ask them why? I'm guessing you've never ever heard anyone say, I am leaving this church because Jesus is just too demanding of me. Anybody ever hear that? I can't be a follower of Jesus anymore. He's just too demanding. In all the years that I served in ministry and had people come and go from churches, I never ever heard anyone say, I'm leaving this church because Jesus is just too demanding. He just asks too much. Mostly I hear things like, I'm leaving this church because I can't stand its people. I can't stand this and I can't stand that. God says this. Look, it's my world. It's my church. And I don't want you to forget that. I'll run the church my way. And I would respond if God came down here and said that to me today, William, it's my church, it's my world, I will run it the way I will run it, and you will do exactly what I tell you, I would be very glad to have that visitation from the Lord. I'd stick with God through thick and thin. I want you to imagine a pastor serving on his district board of church location and building during his first appointment. One autumn day after the appointment began, his study telephone rang out. There were no cell phones then. His DS rang to ask his pastor to meet him at one of the district's churches deep in southern Lancaster County. Now, mind you, these were the days of paper maps. Remember those? Paper maps. Weird old inventions. Little writing on maps with little signs for roads. Now you click something and it takes you there. And if you have the right buttons in your car, you can sit back and sleep and it'll take you there. It might even order something for you from the drive-in and pick it out for you. Well, off this pastor went, down River Road, following the Susquehanna's twists and turns until he reached, let's call it, First Friendly Community Church, where the DS was waiting at the church door. He greeted the DS, who told this fresh-faced pastor that a county sheriff was meeting them to padlock the church. The young pastor was appalled to learn that the church's pastor had led a revolt and convinced a majority of leaders to take over the church. They had already replaced the church's sign with a new one with the church's new name, First Friendly Community Church. Loyal members were furious. Fights broke out. Some of them came into the church to take things that they had gifted to the church, Bibles and hymnals and memorial gifts. And one family even tried to take their family pew with them. The sheriff arrived, and the sheriff did padlock all 3 doors in front of this fresh-faced pastor's eyes and posted no trespassing placards on all 3 doors. And that's when the fresh-faced pastor realized that his DS had brought him along as a witness of a hot mess, but also a witness of a legal proceeding, and a witness to how good and lousy thrive together. A day or two after the padlocking, the revolting pastor and a few of the majority members appeared at the district board of church location and building meeting. They were not there for a negotiation session. The district superintendent brought out the book of discipline, and the DS read the trust clause. And the young pastor, who was the witness, never forgot what the DS said to the church that revolted. Friends, you tried to take one of God's churches, and we can't have that. It's not your church. It's not your congregation's church. It's not the district's church. And it's not the conference's church. It's God's church. Don't forget that. God will run it God's way. The church's pastor and the majority members left, and they started a new church. And on that following Sunday, there was a brand new pastor in the pulpit, and the church began a new chapter, and I'm pleased to tell you that that church still lives and thrives today. More vital than it was when it went through the hot mess. So, let's learn a little something from the parable of the field and the wheat and the weeds. And what is it that we should learn? This is what I want you to learn. Some people are just lousy people. But then again, tax collectors and sinners, they get in ahead of all the rest of us who think we are wheat. Amen.